do that, you can see the nmap command that I used here. I found version light to be really great in helping me scan the internet much faster. The min host group to 1024 helped as well, which is the minimum number of hosts it'll start scanning at one time. So then you can see I've got about 500,000 IP addresses in about 2.7 hours. I did about 22 million in 37.5 hours. Bob did 2 chunks of about 50 million IP addresses, which totaled about probably close to 80 hours to scan the internet. I mean, it's not bad. I mean, it's 80 hours, so you go do other things, hack into other, Bob goes off and does other evil things, I'm sure, while this whole thing is running. But I wanted something to go a little faster. So I started thinking about, and I forget who the quote is from, but they said, surround yourself with very intelligent people. And I do that both in my job at Tenable and on PaulDotCom. So I pull resources in, and I said, well, how would we do this quicker? And I got back some great results, and I found some great results on my own. One is NTP. I mean, H.D. Moore just released recently that he did a great presentation on using NTP to do discovery. And that's great. I'm going to use that and show you some examples of that. Also, the DNS zone transfers from certain DDNS providers. So these are dynamic DNS providers. So if you've got an IP address that changes, you can subscribe to some of these services. They'll attach a name to it, and when your IP address changes, your name will resolve to the new IP address. So you'll have to excuse me while I sit down. I stood for as long as I can. I'm not going anywhere, just sitting. Okay. So the other way would be to brute force the subdomains within a particular DDNS provider. So that means try apple.ourlinksys.com and so on and so forth, orange.ourlinksys.com, and try and find hosts in there. Now that can be faster than scanning the internet. It's not as fast as a zone transfer, as you'll see. And GNU Citizen has a tool that they released where called DNS map, DNS, I forget what it's called. But they've got a tool that does the DNS brute forcing. There's also a module in the Metasploit framework that can do it as well, written by Carlos Perez. So I wanted to try the NTP method because it's really new. And I had heard about this story where Netgear shipped a particular model wireless router and hard-coded the NTP server into the firmware. So whoever got this router, their NTP server that their router would go query is at the University of Wisconsin's computer science department. Now, they weren't too happy about that when the router started shipping, and they got the resulting distributed denial of services attack of 11 million IP addresses hitting their NTP server all at once. That was bad. There was some backlash from that. Now, they issued a firmware fix to change the NTP server so people's routers would start querying Netgear NTP servers. However, who applies firmware updates, right? We established in the beginning of the presentation that most of our family and friends that have these routers, they sit there and collect dust and they never ask about them until they break. So I said, well, it'd be interesting to go query that server, which I found on the internet in a screenshot that is the NTP server that was hard-coded into the Netgear routers. So I said, well, let's do this. I said, if no one's updated their firmware, that means they're still querying the server. I can query this NTP server and get a list of clients that have actively, or the last 600 clients that have queried that NTP server. I'm like, if those are cable modem IP address ranges, they're routers. And not only are they routers, but they're vulnerable routers. So I put my theory to a test. I logged into trusty Metasploit, and I ran the NTP mon list. I set my NTP server to the infamous one at Wisconsin, and I ran it, and I got back a whole bunch of IP addresses. I took those IP addresses with a little command line kung fu, and I translated them into domain names that turns out there was a lot of cable modem and DSL providers in that list. And that tells me that there's an awful lot of people out there that haven't updated their firmware, and that if I persisted, I could continually collect their IP addresses, and if I were really evil and wanted to take over the world, I would target them with attacks. So I thought that was a neat way to find vulnerable routers. Or you could log in and update it for them if you wanted to be nice. But people have gone to jail for writing worms that patch things too, right? So I don't want to go there either. In a much, much, much faster way than the 37 hours to find hosts on the internet that are potentially vulnerable and specifically embedded devices is to do a zone transfer. Now I'm using built-in shell tools here on a Linux machine, and I'm using the domain ourlinksys.com, and I realized that I just told everyone about that, and I haven't really contacted them to tell them that this was broken, so please use this information for good and not evil. And one of their DNS servers at that IP address there, which no one can see, right, actually allows for a zone transfer. And ourlinksys.com is one of those DDNS providers. It spits back a list of about 12,000 hosts in 2.5 seconds. That's way faster than scanning the internet with Nmap. Yes. Oh yeah, you're right, John. Thank you. 120,000. I'm having trouble seeing numbers today. It's the medication. So 120,000 hosts, way faster than 37 hours. So again, check out Metasploit's gather DNS enum. Will do this as well as do the subdomain brute forcing. It'll transfer SRV records, it'll read text records. It's kind of like the Swiss Army knife for DNS hacking. It's in Metasploit, Carlos wrote it, and it works really well. I was having some trouble, but I was trying to use the standalone version that wasn't up to date, but the one in the latest SVN trunk of Metasploit seemed to work the best for me. So here's how you can target specific devices. If I say I just bought a new D-Link DIR655 router, and I have it in my possession, if I want to go find vulnerabilities in it, I can maybe bring up its web interface and say, hey, look, www.dlinkddns.com. That's the default one first in the list for everyone who buys a D-Link router, even the one that I bought. So if I were to find vulnerabilities on my router and then target that DDNS provider with subdomain brute forcing or try and do a zone transfer from one of their DNS servers, which didn't work, by the way, Bob told me. I could then start targeting specific routers with vulnerabilities and find them really easily. So here are some of the steps that attackers would go through in order to control routers. So you buy a router and you find a vulnerability in it. Then you see what DDNS providers it supports by default. You try the zone transfer route. I mean, likely that's not going to work. One of the things Bob told me he was working on was getting a list of almost all of the DDNS providers and then feeding that into the script within Metasploit that automatically tries a zone transfer against every name server that supports the domain and seeing all of the ones which support zone transfers, and that could be a way to find more than just the one example that we put up there. So zone transfer. If zone transfer fails, we can start brute forcing subdomains so we can get dictionaries of likely host names, then brute force the subdomains to find devices. That can be faster. We can check the NTP settings, see if it points to an NTP server, not likely. We, of course, can also scan the internet at random, which tend to be kind of slow. Then using all of those methods, get a nice list of routers to attack and exploit the vulnerabilities and control the routers. So that's the kind of methodology of the attack that I envision that I think we need to start protecting ourselves against. Okay, let's move on to printers. And this one is just hilarious. And I didn't see it the first time I went to it, but if you look up here, Bob found this HP printer on the internet, and it says, in the dialog box that's asking you for a username and password. Now, we all know how important both a username and a password is, right? Important that we have both. Now, it's not two-factor authentication, but it's a username and a password. This dialog box comes up, prompting for a username and a password, and says, to view this page, you must log into this area, and then it says, HP Jet Direct Networking, password only, no username required. Hey, thanks! You eliminated one of the variables for me, you enter the password of password into the password store, and you can control the printer. That's the level of thinking of terms of security that has gone into a lot of these devices. Yes, and it will be unencrypted as well in HTTP, yes. That's one of the points I'll make later is that we want secure management protocols to be the default, right?